So let's start talking about the concept of length. We talked about it earlier in grade one, but now we want to revise this concept of length and then build upon it further. So the first idea is that they have to intuitively have this idea of how long something is, what is longer, what is shorter, what is taller, what is shorter, tallest, shortest, all those things ought to be revised. So first of all, it would be a great idea to revise these concepts. The second thing that I would do is sort of start talking about how are we going to measure how long or short something is. Well, let's say I want to measure how long the blue rectangle is. Well, I can have two measures. I could, for example, even use the red rod. So here's a thick red rod that I could use to measure this. And the way I will measure it is I'm going to try to put the red rods next to each other. Now, the red rods seem to be a bit long, thick. I can make them a bit narrower to make them look a bit more like measuring rods. And now what I can do is I can start to fit these rods in. So I'm going to try to fit these rods in, and you can see approximately two red rods fit in to measure the blue rectangles, right? That's one way that I could do it. So I could say that the blue rectangle is, so if I say length of the rectangle is going to be two red rods, right? That's one option. Well, I could do something else. I could choose not to use the red rods, or I could use the white rods. So the white rods are shorter. So let's see, I have to again do the same thing. I'm trying to fit as many white rods as I can. And as I try to fit in the white rods, I see that I can fit in. I have to fit edge to edge. I can fit in. I can fill um, four white rods. It's the same length, right? So I could use two red rods or four white rods, and they're measuring the same. They're measuring the same length. So what is it capturing? It's capturing the idea. So let's see, what does it mean? It also means I can put the red rods next to it. So let me put the red rods back in, and you can see that each red rod is about two white rods long. So this would make a lot of sense because this red rod is really one red rod. So here it is. It is one red rod is equal to two white rods. So you can see if this is two white rods, and this red rod is also two white rods, then there'll be a total of four white rods, and which is exactly the same length as two red rods, because it is capturing the idea that how long something is. So we have to have a measure with which you are going to measure the length of something. Okay, and that's that idea that you have to capture, that the measuring rod is arbitrary. It could be white or red, but it is measuring the same thing, because when you put the two red rods together, or four white rods together, you can see that they are measuring the same length, right? So this looks a bit thicker, so that must be a bit bothersome. I'm trying to um, get both of these to be the same thickness, so they are approximately now the same thickness. So now you can see that whether you measure two red rods or four white rods, it's measuring the same length, because if I move them away and I put them together, so you can see that I really want to get this idea across, that this length that you are measuring is exactly the same, because what you're really measuring is the distance from here all the way down to here, and you can measure it in either way. Okay, so that's one idea that you want to get across. So whether they use a meter rod, and they have to have some, they should be using a meter rod, or whether they start to measure length in centimeters. Now remember, if you're trying to measure the length in, let's say you have a ruler and you want to measure the length in terms of white rods, the way, if you want to measure, let's say, I don't know, if you want to measure maybe a distance from, um, let's say a distance from here to here. So what you're going to do is that you're going to take a white rod and put it here, then you take another white rod and put it here, and then you can see you're about two white rods long. You don't want to leave gaps between the rods. You also don't want the rods to overlap, because then you're not really measuring the distance, you're measuring something else, and that's important. Okay, and that idea, you have to talk to children about it. You can measure in meters, or you can measure in centimeters, or you can measure in anything else that you wish to. Okay, and that's just an arbitrary measure that we are using, which would be a foot, a centimeter, a meter, a yard, and what that depends upon is really convenience, right? So that's another thing that you could talk about. You could talk about, if you're measuring the distance, which are very long distances, you want your measure to be long, and if you're measuring very short distances, you want your measure to be short so that you can measure it accurately. I would urge you to get your child to experiment with your meter rod. So give them maybe a small sharpener and give them a meter rod and ask them to measure how many meter rods fit in, and they'll get confused. But if you were to cut off a centimeter rod, you can take your the meter rod, and or you can make a centimeter rod which is cut off something which is just a centimeter, and then ask them to measure a sharpener or an eraser. They'll find it much easier. So it's getting that idea across, that whether you want to you have to use the appropriate measure to measure appropriate lengths. Okay, now the next idea that I want to talk about is that you can have curved paths, right? So there are questions in the book that talk about curved paths, like something over here, right? So here's a path in the book which looks like this, and there's a path which looks like this, and there's another path which maybe looks like this, and you have to figure out which one is the shortest or the longest path. So the idea that they have to get across really is, so I should have drawn this slightly better. This looks more like this, right? You can clearly see that the blue path is longer than the yellow path, which is longer than the white path. But how does a child know it? Well, maybe we can start talking about something like this, that let's say you want to go from point A to point B. So what we want to do is we want to find out, there's a path from A to B along the red line, and there's also a path from A to B along the green line. So I can make this motion, right? And you can see that all my white lines that I can use are the same length. So I can start to put them together, and what I can show you is that clearly these two, the straight path on the red line from A to B is two white lines long. And now let me rotate these white lines and put them on the green path. So now I have rotated my lines, and now let me put them along these lines and show you that the green path is actually 4 white lines long. Right? So this is the big idea, that curved is longer than straight. So if you have a curved path, how do you measure a curved path? Well, the idea is to straighten out the green path. So what we really, you can see that you took, if every white rod is a step, you took 4 steps to cover the green path. And now what you can do is, a simpler way to do it would be to flatten out the green path and then to measure the length. How do you flatten out the green path? Well, you could probably put a string around the green path, just like the yellow line that I drew. So by the yellow line, this is the line that I drew earlier, And this is really putting a string around it and then flattening out the string and measuring the length. That should be intuitively capturing the idea of length. Another way that we could do it is by just taking out the green path and flattening it out. So let me do that next. As I flattened out the green path and I put it together, and this is exactly, so this is the same as the white line that we had earlier. And now if I make 4 copies of this white line and show you, that you can see that this path is going to be exactly the same as 4 white lines, exactly as it was supposed to be. So you can see that the curve path, so there are two sort of things that we have learned. One is obviously that the curve path is longer than the straight path, and the other idea is to squash down a curve path. So for example, if you have a curve path like this, the idea is that what you do is you run a string around these curve paths, and then you squash down or you stretch the string so that you can get the length of the path, because what you've done earlier is really straightened out the paths. That's what you did earlier to the green path. So similarly, what you want to do is you're going to straighten out the path over here and measure the length. And that's the idea, that you run a string along the path, and then you straighten out the path, and that should give you an intuitive idea, an exact measurement of what the path length is.